Everyone believed the system worked. If you were innocent, you would go home. That's what people say about the American justice system, that it protects the innocent, that it moves carefully, that it requires proof. In May 2010, in the Bronx, New York, a 16-year-old high school student named Kalief Browder was walking home from a party. He had no criminal record. He had never been convicted of a crime. He was stopped by police officers responding to a complaint. A man had reported that, weeks earlier, he had been robbed of a backpack. The alleged victim claimed he recognized one of the people involved. He pointed at Kalief. There was no recovered property, no surveillance footage, no fingerprints, no physical evidence tying Kalief to the alleged robbery. The identification was uncertain. The alleged victim admitted he had not seen the faces clearly during the original incident. But an arrest was made. Kalief insisted he was innocent. He said he had never stolen anything. He was taken into custody and charged with robbery in the second degree, a felony under New York law. At arraignment, bail was set at $3,000. To a judge processing dozens of cases that day, it was routine. To Kalief's family, it was unreachable. His mother, Browder, did not have that money available. The family lived modestly. $3,000 was more than rent, more than groceries, more than what could be gathered quickly. Bail is not supposed to determine guilt. It is supposed to ensure court appearance, but in practice, it determines freedom. If you pay, you wait for trial at home. If you cannot, you wait behind bars. Kalief could not pay, so he was sent to Rikers Island. Rikers Island is a jail complex located between the Bronx and Queens. It houses thousands of detainees, most of whom are awaiting trial, not serving sentences. Many are there simply because they cannot afford bail. Kalief was 16. He entered a facility known for violence. At first, everyone believed it would be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a few months. The Constitution of the United States guarantees the right to a speedy trial. It is written clearly in the Sixth Amendment. The system is not designed to hold unconvicted teenagers indefinitely, but the system is slow. Court dates were scheduled, then postponed. The prosecution asked for adjournments. The alleged victim failed to appear. The arresting officer did not show up for one hearing. Each time the judge reset the date. Each time, Kalief was sent back to his cell. Weeks became months became a year. Kalief refused to plead guilty. Prosecutors offered him deals. If he admitted guilt, he could be released sooner. He refused. He would not confess to something he said he did not do. That refusal had consequences. Inside Rikers Island, Kalief became vulnerable. He was young, smaller than many of the other detainees. Violence was common. Inmates fought. Gangs operated openly. Correctional officers often looked the other way. Kalief was assaulted by other detainees. Surveillance footage later released would show him being beaten by other inmates while officers failed to intervene quickly. He was also involved in altercations with correction officers. In one recorded incident, officers forcibly restrained him, throwing him to the ground. These were not isolated events. They were part of daily life. Because of disciplinary infractions, some related to fights, Kalief was placed in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement at Rikers meant 23 hours per day in a cell, alone. Minimal human contact, limited phone calls, limited visitation. Sometimes lights stayed on continuously. Solitary is not designed for comfort. It is designed for control. Kalief would spend nearly 2 years of his 3-year incarceration in solitary confinement. He entered Rikers at 16. He turned 17 there. He turned 18 there. He watched other detainees come and go. Some had been convicted of violent crimes and served shorter total sentences than the time he was waiting without trial. His case was adjourned more than 30 times. No trial began. The prosecution was not ready. The alleged victim became unreachable. Evidence was weak. But the case did not disappear. It lingered, and Kalief remained in jail. His mother visited when she could. She asked lawyers for updates. Public defenders were overloaded with cases. They handled hundreds at a time. There was little urgency. The system did not see Kalief as urgent. He was just another docket number. The longer he stayed, the more normal it became. A teenager in jail without a conviction, waiting. That was the official story. A young man accused of robbery, held on bail, awaiting trial. But there was a crack in that story. The crack was time. Because time is not neutral in jail. Time becomes pressure. Time becomes damage. And the longer Kalief waited, the clearer it became that something inside the system was not functioning the way people believed it did. The question was no longer whether he would have a trial. The question was how much of him would be left when it finally happened. By 2011, Kalief Browder had already spent more than a year inside Rikers Island. He was 17 years old. He had not been convicted. He had not gone to trial. He was still legally presumed innocent. But innocence inside Rikers did not function as protection. It functioned as irrelevance. Court dates came and went. In the Bronx criminal court, prosecutors requested adjournments repeatedly. Sometimes they said they needed more time to prepare. Sometimes witnesses failed to appear. Sometimes paperwork was incomplete. Each delay added weeks, sometimes months. The case was postponed more than 30 times. 30. Each time Kalief was transported in chains to court, placed in a holding cell, and brought before a judge. Each time he expected movement, and each time the hearing lasted only minutes. Adjourned. Back to Rikers. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy trial, but enforcement depends on lawyers filing motions, judges asserting limits, prosecutors being prepared. In overloaded courtrooms, delay becomes routine. Kalief's public defenders were managing overwhelming caseloads, hundreds of clients, limited time, limited investigation capacity. They were not malicious. They were overwhelmed. The prosecution offered plea deals. If Kalief admitted guilt, he could be released for time served. 3 years would not have happened if he had accepted, but accepting would mean carrying a felony conviction for the rest of his life. He refused. He said he would not confess to a robbery he did not commit. That refusal isolated him further. Inside Rikers, Kalief's adolescence was replaced by survival. He learned quickly that vulnerability attracted attention. He had to defend himself. When attacked, he fought back. When threatened, he responded. Violence was currency. Disciplinary reports accumulated, and each infraction increased the likelihood of solitary confinement. Solitary at Rikers meant a small, concrete cell, steel door, narrow bed, toilet, a sink, minimal light, 23 hours per day inside, 1 hour for recreation in a cage, no meaningful human contact. Psychologists have documented the effects of prolonged isolation, anxiety, paranoia, depression, hallucinations. For adolescents, the damage can be even more severe. The brain is still developing. Emotional regulation is fragile. Kalief spent nearly 2 of his 3 years in solitary. He was beaten by other inmates. Video footage later obtained by journalists showed him attacked by a group of detainees while officers delayed intervention. In another clip, correction officers were seen using force against him, throwing him to the ground. These were not rumors. They were recorded. But recordings did not accelerate his trial. They did not reduce his bail. They did not trigger emergency review. The machine continued. Rikers Island had long been criticized for violence and abuse. Reports from civil rights groups documented excessive force, particularly against young detainees. But institutional reform moves slowly. Inside the jail, time expands. Days feel longer. Weeks feel endless. Birthdays pass without ceremony. Kalief turned 18 behind bars. He became an adult inside a system that had already shaped him through isolation and fear. Meanwhile, outside, his family continued fighting. His mother, Kalief Browder, attended court appearances. She demanded answers. Why was the case not moving? Why was her son still there? Why had no trial date been secured? The answers were procedural. The complainant had left the country. The prosecution could not confirm his availability. Without the alleged victim's testimony, the case weakened. But instead of dismissing it immediately, adjournments continued. The system is built on momentum. Once a person enters it, motion continues by default. Cases do not vanish automatically. They linger unless someone pushes to end them. No one pushed hard enough. Kalief filed complaints about conditions. He reported assaults. He requested protection. Protection often meant isolation. Solitary was presented as safety, but safety without human contact becomes another form of punishment. At one point, Kalief attempted to take his own life inside the jail. He tied a bedsheet around his neck. Officers intervened. The attempt did not trigger immediate release. It triggered monitoring. And then he returned to the same environment. Years passed. In 2013, after more than 3 years of pretrial detention, prosecutors finally dismissed the charges. Not because a jury acquitted him, not because a judge ruled on innocence, because they admitted they did not have sufficient evidence. The alleged victim was unreachable. The case could not proceed. Kalief walked out of Rikers Island at age 20. He had entered at 16. He had spent 100 days in jail, nearly 800 of those in solitary confinement. He had never been convicted of a crime. Officially, the case was over, but the waiting machine had already done its work. The question was no longer whether the system would convict him. The question was whether it had already punished him beyond repair. When Kalief Browder walked out of Rikers Island in June 2013, he was 20 years old. He had entered at 16. He left without a conviction. Legally, he was free. Psychologically, he was not. Freedom did not feel like release. It felt unfamiliar. The world had moved without him. His friends had graduated. His classmates had advanced. Time had not paused while he sat in a cell. He tried to rebuild. He enrolled in classes. He attempted to restart his education. He wanted structure. He wanted normalcy. But normalcy is difficult after prolonged isolation. Solitary confinement does not end when the door opens. It follows. Kalief struggled with paranoia. Loud noises triggered panic. He had difficulty sleeping. He described intrusive memories of assaults. He felt constantly on edge, as if the threat had never disappeared. In interviews later conducted by journalists, he explained that isolation had changed the way he processed reality. Silence felt oppressive. Crowds felt dangerous. Trust felt impossible. He had survived Rikers. But survival is not recovery. The psychological damage of nearly 2 years in solitary confinement is documented in clinical research. Extended isolation can produce symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, hypervigilance, depression, suicidal ideation. Kalief experienced all of it. In 2014, his case gained national attention after investigative reporting by journalist Jennifer Gonnerman in The New Yorker. The article detailed his detention, the repeated delays, the solitary confinement, the beatings captured on video. The public reaction was immediate. How could a teenager be held for 3 years without trial? Why had no judge intervened? Why had the prosecution continued requesting adjournments when evidence was weak? The case exposed structural issues in New York's bail system. Bail had not assessed danger. It had assessed poverty. If Kalief's family had possessed $3,000 in May 2010, he would have waited for trial. At home, he would not have entered Rikers. He would not have experienced solitary confinement. The dividing line was money. Following the article, scrutiny intensified around Rikers Island. Federal investigations examined patterns of violence against adolescents. Reports documented excessive force by correction officers. Civil rights organizations pointed to systemic abuse. Kalief became a symbol, but symbols do not sleep peacefully. He continued to struggle. He attempted suicide multiple times. After his release, in one instance, he jumped from a window. He survived. In another, he tried to hang himself. Each time, emergency intervention saved him physically. Emotionally, he remained unstable. In June 2015, 2 years after his release, Kalief Browder died by suicide at his family's home in the Bronx. He was 22 years old. He had never been convicted of the robbery for which he had been arrested. His mother, Vanita Browder, publicly blamed the system. She argued that Rikers Island had broken her son. She described watching him deteriorate after release. She spoke of the sleepless nights, the fear, the trauma that did not fade. The system called it tragic, but tragedy suggests inevitability. This was not inevitable. It was procedural. The delays were procedural. The bail amount was procedural. The adjournments were procedural. The solitary placements were procedural. At no single point did one dramatic decision destroy him. It was accumulation. It was repetition. It, too, was indifference stretched across 100 days. After his death, calls for reform intensified. New York City moved to limit the use of solitary confinement for adolescents. Years later, bail reform legislation reduced cash bail for many nonviolent offenses. Politicians cited Kalief Browder when debating change. His name entered policy discussions. But reform does not reverse damage. Kalief lost 3 years of adolescence. He lost educational stability. He lost psychological safety. And, eventually, he lost his life. The most disturbing part of his case is not that the system collapsed spectacularly. It did not collapse. It functioned. Judges processed calendars. Prosecutors requested time. Public defenders managed caseloads. Correction officers enforced rules. Every component operated within its assigned role. And yet, the outcome was catastrophic. No single villain. No singular dramatic conspiracy. Just institutional inertia. Kalief Browder was a 16-year-old from the Bronx, arrested in May 2010 for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was held at Rikers Island for 3 years because his family could not afford $3,000 bail. He spent nearly 2 of those years in solitary confinement. The charges were dismissed in 2013 due to insufficient evidence. He died by suicide in 2015 at age 22. That is the record. But the record does not capture the internal damage of prolonged isolation. It does not measure the weight of waiting without end. It does not quantify the erosion of identity that occurs when a teenager is treated as disposable. The question his case leaves behind is not abstract. It is practical. How long can a person be kept in a cage before something inside them stops functioning? For Kalief Browder, the answer was 3 years. Because the real story is never on the surface. It's under the surface.